And so the historians are always trying to find where Reedmore was, a sort of place of reeds, as it were. And the cannonball had been found sort of 2 miles down the road, sort of pinpointing the exact location. But as I was coming to finich the book, it's quite sort of nice symmetry. Last August, I was just putting sort of finishing touches to the final draft when I turned on the BBC News channel and saw suddenly Richard's body has possibly been discovered. And I was probably one of the few people who thought, oh gosh, here we go, I'll rewrite the ending of the book. And that really does sort of complement the rediscovery of the battlefield site, because it tells us exactly how Richard died. He was pushed into a marsh by William Stanley's forces charging in at the end of the battle. And some of the sources talk about him being killed by a Welsh halberdier, and a halberd is a sort of a long axe on a 6-foot pole. And actually, when we look at the skeleton, the remains, we can see that the back of Richard's skull has been completely shaved off by a halberd. So it sort of confirms the contemporary source accounts that actually give description about how Richard exactly died.
And one of the other things, I suppose, the discovery confirmed was that he was, in Shakespeare's phrase, crook-backed. He did have an abnormality of the spine, scoliosis. How would that have affected our understanding of his life? Because at one time this was dismissed as possibly just propaganda.
Yeah.
But if someone did have a sort of visible abnormality in their form in those days, it would have affected the way people looked at them perhaps much more than it would now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way they fought. I mean, one of the interesting things is Richard went into battle wearing a full suit of armour, the crown on his head, but his armour would have been absolutely tied up against his body. So if you did have a supposed hunchback, the armour would have had to have been specially designed for that. I think what's really interesting about the scoliosis in the spine is that for generations people have said, oh, it's Tudor propaganda made up by Thomas More, and now we're having to reassess exactly all these sources. Who was Richard? He clearly did have some form of hunchback or kink in his spine, but it doesn't seem to have affected his ability to fight. You know, he was a successful military general who fought at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury and at Bosworth. So it's interesting in terms of perception of disability, and I think that's something that, you know, we're going to have to explore from henceforth, having made this discovery.
I mean, it's sometimes said that in that era, if you didn't look quite as others, people saw that as a sign of a sort of evil nature or something like that. Would people have done that to a nobleman of Richard's standing, a member of the royal family?
Yep, and there are contemporary accounts of talking about him being a hunchback, a crooked back, he's called in one account in the medieval records in York, and died in a ditch like a dog. And it's very much the sort of idea that having a hunchback is sort of possession of the devil. And in particular, if your right shoulder is higher than your left, then actually it's actually meant to be the left shoulder that sort of Thomas More twists it around. So actually he gives Richard's left shoulder being higher than his right. We actually know that Richard's right shoulder was higher than his left, but because the left side being sinister in the Latin and as I said, associated with devilish practices.
Now, you spent, as you say, 3 years writing this book, even before the body was discovered. And one of the interesting things about this period is just how thin the sources seem to be. There are 1 or 2 chronicles and histories about, there are fragments of documents here and there, but it is not the best recorded period of British history by any means, is it?
No, I mean, previously I've written books on mid-Tudor history, or a book on Edward VI and a book on Elizabeth I, and you've got sort of quite a lot of private letters that exist, a big sort of state papers archive. When you get to the 15th century, it dries up. There's only about 10 letters of Richard III that actually exist, but I'm quite an evangelical when it comes to finding new sources. I do believe in the National Archive there are more documents there, legal records, exchequer records, chancery records, than there are historians to actually go through them. And it is a needle in the haystack job, and you may just find that sort of small bit of information, but I do believe there is stuff still to be found. In the book I cover Henry Tudor's exile in France and Brittany, and I went to in my holiday, archives in Vannes, in Nantes, and there are glimpses of Henry's life as an exile, which you can tease out and put into a book. So I do believe there's still stuff to be found, even though it's quite slim pickings. And
the stories are so fascinating. You go through the backstory of the Wars of the Roses, and what strikes you reading through these things is the dizzying change of fortunes. 1 minute you're a king or a great lord of the realm, the next minute you're running for your life because someone's betrayed you and various of your relatives have been beheaded, and you might be next if you don't make it to a port quickly enough. You can begin to understand the paranoid climate there must have been at that time.
And also the fatalism. Medieval society very much did view life as the turn of fortune's wheel. sort of paintings of Edward IV dangling on Fortune's wheel at the top with Henry VI down the bottom. But people knew that the wheel would also turn. And what's fascinating is that people will sit out of politics for 14 years and sort of come back, having sort of been crushed in one battle. The Earl of Oxford, for instance, is somebody who loses everything in 1471 but comes back triumphant in 1485. And that sense of perspective that actually it isn't all over, contrasts somewhat with modern politics, where suddenly you lose a leadership election, that's it, your career's done. They were patient in the 15th century, and I think that we could learn quite a bit from their antics.
So you could breathe in it. But when you look at Richard III, his father was probably killed after a battle, and his head ended up on one of the gates of York. One of his brothers was killed. He was later betrayed by the man who had previously been their chief ally. All the rest of it all builds up to the picture of someone who would have, by the time he became king, have had a pretty ruthless survival instinct, and certainly doesn't seem like a man who, if necessary, would have scrupled in killing his two nephews, the princes in the Tower, his brother's sons, if that meant his own personal survival.
Yeah, and I think what you have to do with when you look at Richard's personality from a historical perspective is to understand all these influences and what may have happened. Richard is a young man. I mean, everyone sort of looks at the Shakespearean villain probably in his 50s or 60s, but he's 32 when it comes to... He's my age when it comes to the Battle of Bosworth. He fights his first battle at the age of only 16. And so he even from the very start, has a traumatic life. But he realises it's kill or be killed sometimes. And when it comes to the death of Edward IV on the 9th of April 1483, dies only age 41, suddenly leaves this 13-year-old heir, Richard realises that the Woodvilles, the faction against him, may turn against him as the king's brother. And he can't risk losing the power and influence that he's gained. So, in a way, when you look at the brutal nature of society in those days, Edward IV dispatching Henry VI, 28,000 men killed at the Battle of Towton in 1461, it made sense to Richard to take that calculation. I think that I wouldn't condone infanticide, but in the morality of the period of that century, we can't take a 20th century, 21st century view of these things. It made sense that if Richard was going to ensure that he was going to keep his own survival, he had to take the throne.
When he took the throne, though, he sort of pushed his nephews aside, locked them up in the Tower, and they were basically never seen again. When he took the throne, what seemed to happen next was that his political base crumbled with amazing rapidity. He at one stage, one of his brother's closest allies, Lord Hastings, is more or less dragged out of a royal council and beheaded on the spot. Another very close ally, the Duke of Buckingham, rebels and goes away. Why did it crumble so rapidly? Was it the fact of the usurpation? Was it the expectation that he was going to have to kill the princes in the Tower? Was it something else?
I think it's because the princes are dead. I think that when you look at Richard taking the throne, he actually has support from Edward IV's household as long as Edward V is kept alive. But soon they will turn up to Richard's coronation, for instance, they will back him. As soon as the princes are killed in the Tower, and what's really interesting is there is a letter from Richard on the 29th of July 1483 where he talks about there being an enterprise committed in the Tower. And it seems that there was an attempt to free the princes from the Tower that seemed to have gone wrong. And it's at that moment they are either killed in this aborted attempt to free them, or Richard made that decision when he was probably in Warwick Castle in early August 1483. Once they are dead, the Yorkist polity collapses. All the men who backed Edward IV think that's it, and they rebel against Richard. And once they rebel, Richard manages to crush the rebellion, but they all defect to Henry Tudor in this bizarre coalition.
There he is waiting in Brittany and gathering up the remnants of the previous regime who switch over to his side.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting that when he finally does, after years of being a political pawn, get his moment to be something more, he's got a political as well as a military strategy. He lands in Wales and gathers support from there. This suggests someone who's perhaps a bit shrewder than your average medieval potentate.
Yeah, and Henry Tudor himself is a very different kind of character. And he's somebody also who is sort of born and raised in this crucible of defeat. And, the determination comes from that. He talks about it to one chronicler at the time, being a prisoner all his life. And he's locked away in France and Brittany as a sort of political pawn on the sort of diplomatic stage. And when he comes and lands in Wales, he carefully has calculated a journey. He's managed to write to supporters in advance. And in a way, it's the sort of first successful foreign invasion since 1066, because while Henry has 500 English supporters, the majority of his troops are French mercenaries.
And so in he comes, and it's politics that triumphs again when you get to the battlefield of Bosworth, because a sizable faction of Richard's army suddenly turns on him.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Bosworth is it seems this sort of, as you mentioned, the crown and the thorn bush, this providential act of God. Nothing could be further from the truth. This was a battle that Richard was overjoyed when Henry Tudor landed in Wales, because he thought this was the moment where he can crush him. Richard's never lost a battle. Henry's never fought a battle. And so actually when it comes to the armies lining up on the field, Richard has 15,000 men. Henry only has 5,000 men. The odds of Henry winning, were impossible. And actually it took Richard's almost kamikaze, sort of suicidal-like charge towards Henry Tudor's standard, which is actually when he threw it all away. But it's not just Richard and Henry at Bosworth. It's also the noblemen there. It's the Stanleys. It's the Earl of Northumberland who stands still at the back and doesn't move. What are their motivations for defecting from Richard? What are their motivations for treachery? Which is what I try to explore in the book, because it's a really fascinating battle that isn't just about some military manoeuvres. It's about how have people arrived at this stage where they decide to overthrow someone who is, after all, for all intents and purposes, an anointed king.
That wonderful phrase in there, Dickon thy master is bought and sold. So it was at least as much a political as a military victory for Henry VII when he did manage to defeat Richard. But when that transfer of power came, when he's crowned with Richard's crown on the battlefield, are we talking about a sudden sea change in the way that England is governed, or are we just replacing one medieval potentate with another? Most people, the serf in the field would have noticed little difference.
I think so. This whole idea of the 1485 being this milestone where the medieval period ends and the modern period begins, I think that was born about of sort of school curriculum and textbooks. But I'm still of the school that while there is a huge degree of continuity, Henry Tudor does mark something different. There is almost an end to the age of chivalry. And I'd say that in terms of his relationship with his nobility, that actually he begins to put them under bonds, recognizances they're called, and also his experience in France and Brittany rubs off on him. So he starts setting up almost like a mini standing army, the Yeomen of the Guard, which models exactly what's happened at the French court. And he's got a French confessor. All his confessors throughout the rest of his life are French, which suggests maybe Henry Tudor actually thought in French, and he's more of a French king than actually an English one.
It's a fascinating transition. But just a final thought, because you're now moving into doing a full-dress biography of Richard III himself. He's a man there is such black and white views of. He's either the Shakespearean villain or perhaps this almost implausibly modern Renaissance monarch. Which way are you going to jump?
Well, I'm going to be sort of the politician's answer in sort of a Blairite middle way. The book is going to be called The Lives of Richard III, because exactly for the reasons you state, Richard himself, the territory that's been staked over, it's been two camps, the sort of pro-Richard, can't do anything wrong, whiter than white camp, or the sort of black legend, Richard being an evil monster. And given the mores of the time, actually Richard is both. And we've got to get away from just being in one camp or another. And so the idea of this book, a big book, I want to, there's been lots of books on Richard, but often they've not gone back to the original sources, is to reinvestigate Richard's life, look at his early years, as you mentioned, what sort of influenced him to actually ultimately make that decision to take the throne, and really investigate, almost day by day, how Richard arrived at his decision to crown himself Richard III.
My kingdom for a copy. Chris Skidmore, thanks very much indeed for joining us. And BOOKtalk will be back again next week. Do join us then.